A businessman was buying a present for his daughter until he noticed a sad little beggar girl watching from outside. As he stared at her, he was petrified to see that she was identical to his missing daughter, and when he told his wife, he was horrified by what she revealed to him. Isabella was pressing her nose against the glass, drawing small shapes with the tip of her finger, as she gazed in fascination at the dolls and bicycles displayed in the toy store's window. The morning chill nipped at her cheeks, but she didn't mind. She had been looking forward to this day for so long. Her father had promised that today he would finally buy her the bike she had been dreaming of. Carlos, her father, stood a few steps away, distracted by his phone, checking emails and work messages, unaware of the excitement filling his daughter. To him, this was just another transaction. He had worked hard. He could afford this luxury for his daughter, and he didn't see beyond the material satisfaction it represented. However, for Isabella, the day was much more than that. Inside the store, the red bicycle with silver details stood out among the others. It was the one she had pictured in her dreams. But just as she was about to enter, something stopped her. On the other side of the window, a girl, about her age, identical to her, was watching her with an intense and almost empty gaze. She was wearing a worn-out jacket and a pair of shoes that had clearly seen better days. Beside her, a woman, probably her mother, looked at her with tenderness but also with evident sadness in her eyes. The girl wasn't looking at the bicycles. Her gaze was fixed on a doll, a beautiful doll with blonde hair and blue eyes, dressed in a princess gown that sparkled under the store lights. The girl didn't say anything, but her eyes said it all. She wanted that doll more than anything in the world. Isabella felt a knot in her stomach. Something in the girl's expression made her pause, and suddenly, the idea of the bike didn't seem as exciting anymore. Her father, noticing that she wasn't moving, looked up from his phone. "What's wrong, Isa?" Carlos asked, stepping closer. "Come on, pick out whichever bike you want. We don't have all day." Isabella didn't respond immediately. She slowly turned toward him, still with her eyes fixed on the doll and the girl on the other side of the glass. "Dad," she said softly, as if carefully choosing her words. "I don't want the bike." Carlos frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean, you don't?" he asked, leaning down to her. "You've been talking about the bike for weeks. What's going on?" Isabella looked into her father's eyes, then pointed toward the window. "I want that doll," she said with unusual firmness in her voice. "The one right there." Carlos, puzzled, followed the direction of her gaze. His eyes landed on the doll, and then on the girl who was watching from outside. Something started to click in his mind, but he wasn't sure what it was. He turned back to Isabella, trying to understand the sudden change in her wishes. "The doll?" he repeated, incredulously. "Weren't we here for the bike? You know you can have whatever you want, Isa. If you want the bike, the doll, whatever, it's fine. But I don't understand why you changed your mind." Isabella sighed, looking at her father with a maturity that seemed beyond her 8 years. "That girl," she said, pointing to the little one on the other side. "She wants the doll, but her mom can't buy it for her. Dad, I want you to buy the doll so I can give it to her." Carlos was silent for a moment. His gaze shifted between the doll, the unknown girl, and his own daughter. Something inside him, perhaps a flicker of pride or a flash of doubt, made him feel uneasy. "Are you sure about this, Isa?" he asked, leaning in to look her in the eye. "Why would you do something like that? You've been asking for the bike for weeks, and now, suddenly, you want to give it to a girl you don't even know." Isabella looked at him with a mix of tenderness and determination. "Dad, she needs it more than I do," she replied, her voice soft but full of conviction. "I already have lots of things. She hardly has anything. And, I don't know, I just feel like it's the right thing to do." Carlos rubbed his temple, feeling a wave of confusion. He didn't fully understand his daughter's logic. He had worked hard to be able to buy her anything she wanted, so she wouldn't lack anything, and yet here she was, wanting to give away something so significant. What did this mean for him as a father? "All right," he finally said, trying to hide his surprise. "If that's what you want, then we'll do it. I'll buy the doll." Isabella smiled, but not with the excitement a child would normally have when getting a new toy. Her smile was calm, as if she knew she was about to do something bigger than just receiving a material object. Carlos headed to the register and bought the doll. Meanwhile, Isabella stepped out of the store, crossing the street toward the girl and her mother. With the doll in her hands, she walked determinedly, though her heart was beating fast in her chest. When she reached them, she extended the toy toward the girl, without saying a word at first. The girl looked at her in astonishment, and then her eyes filled with tears. She looked at her mother, who was also surprised and, at the same time, deeply moved. "It's for you," Isabella said softly. "I hope you like it." The girl couldn't speak, her hands trembling as she took the doll, clutching it as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. The mother, with tear-filled eyes, tried to refuse the gift out of courtesy. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's too much." But Isabella insisted, with a smile that radiated a purity and kindness that was impossible to reject. "It's what I want," she affirmed sweetly. "Really?" Finally, the mother nodded gratefully. There weren't enough words to express what she felt at that moment, but her eyes said everything. As they walked away, Isabella stood still, watching them, feeling a warmth in her chest she had never felt before. She knew she had done the right thing, even if she couldn't fully explain it. Carlos, watching from a distance, felt something inside him that he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite name. But one thing was clear. His daughter, with that simple act, had shaken his worldview. "Let's go home, Isa," he said finally, stepping closer to her. As they walked together, Carlos couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. It wasn't just the day that had changed. Something deeper had shifted inside him, though he still didn't understand what. The sound of the keys turning in the lock echoed in the small apartment. Carlos opened the door, letting Isabella go in first. The warm atmosphere of the home contrasted with the cold air they had left behind in the streets. The ride home had been quiet. Carlos, lost in his thoughts, hadn't spoken, and Isabella, though content with what she had done, seemed equally pensive. Elena, Isabella's mother, was waiting for them in the living room, sitting on the couch with a magazine in her hands. When she saw them walk in, she looked up, offering a brief smile. "How did it go?" she asked, getting up and approaching them with a casual air. "Did Isa get her bike?" Carlos glanced at Isabella before responding. He had spent the entire ride back trying to organize his thoughts, but every time he returned to the image of his daughter giving away the doll, something unsettled him. It wasn't exactly discomfort, but it wasn't pride either. Maybe it was perplexity or a confusing mix of emotions he couldn't categorize. "No, we didn't get the bike," Carlos said, putting the keys in the bowl by the entrance. Elena looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean you didn't get the bike?" she asked, turning her attention to Isabella. "Did you change your mind at the last minute, Isa?" The girl shook her head slowly, her face serene. "I didn't want the bike, Mom," she explained softly, as if it were the most obvious thing. "I bought a doll instead." Elena blinked, surprised. She knew how much Isabella had been talking about the bike in the past few weeks. They had even gone to the store together to pick it out days earlier. Something didn't add up. "A doll?" she repeated, incredulously. "But why did you change your mind?" Isabella looked at her with her big, sincere eyes, as if the answer should be clear to everyone. "Because there was a girl who couldn't have it, "Mom," she explained. "Her mother couldn't buy it for her, and I thought I could give her the doll. I don't need the bike right now." Elena stood in silence for a moment. The initial surprise quickly faded, replaced by a growing discomfort she couldn't fully hide. Unlike Carlos, who had spent most of the day grappling with the impact of their daughter's generosity, Elena didn't seem to share the same sentiment. In fact, something in her expression suggested that Isabella's decision didn't seem as admirable to her as it might have to her husband. "You gave the doll to a girl you don't even know?" Elena smiled, but it was a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Isa, that's very sweet of you, but you can't go around giving things to strangers. We don't know who they are, or what they might think of you." Carlos, who had remained silent until now, decided to step in. "Elena, it wasn't a reckless act," Carlos said with unusual calm. "Isabella saw that girl couldn't have the doll, and she just decided to do something kind. There's nothing wrong with that." Elena looked at him, surprised by his tone. She had always assumed that Carlos would be more on the side of prudence and financial sensibility, and she hadn't expected him to defend Isabella's decision so passionately. "I'm not saying it's wrong to be generous," Elena replied, her tone sharpening slightly, "but we need to teach Isa to think about herself too. She can't always put other people's needs above her own. If she keeps doing that, people will take advantage of her. And that's not what I want for my daughter." Carlos frowned, feeling the conversation was taking a direction he didn't like. "Elena, she just wanted to do something nice. We can't teach her to distrust everyone from such a young age." "It's not distrust, it's caution," Elena countered, raising a hand in a gesture of patience. "We're teaching her to be independent, to make decisions for her own benefit. Today it was a doll, and tomorrow what will it be? Will she give away everything she is just because someone else wants it? That's not realistic, Carlos." Isabella, who had been quietly listening, felt a knot form in her throat. She didn't understand why her mother was upset. She had done what she thought was right. She turned to her father for support, but Carlos seemed deep in thought, pondering Elena's words. The atmosphere was growing tense and uncomfortable. "Mom," Isabella began, her voice low but firm, "I just wanted to help. That girl didn't have anything and—" Elena interrupted her gently, but firmly. "I know, Isa, and that's admirable, but you have to learn to take care of yourself too. You have to think about what you need. You can't carry other people's problems." Isabella lowered her gaze, feeling a pang of confusion. It wasn't that she didn't understand what her mother was trying to say, but it seemed like they were seeing the world from completely different perspectives. To her, generosity wasn't a burden, but a way to connect with others. However, in that moment, she couldn't find the words to explain it. Carlos, noticing his daughter's discomfort, decided to put an end to the conversation. "That's enough for today, Elena," he said in a conciliatory tone. "Isabella did something good, and I think we can all learn from that." Elena looked at him, clearly not satisfied, but dropped the subject for the moment. "All right," she murmured, sighing in resignation. "I guess we'll talk about this later." Feeling somewhat deflated by her mother's response, Isabella decided to retreat to her room without saying another word. She climbed the stairs slowly, feeling a weight that hadn't been there before. She closed the door behind her and sat on her bed, staring out the window. Outside, the city lights twinkled in the distance, but inside her, there was a strange feeling of emptiness. Why did something that had felt so right now make her feel so unsure? Carlos watched his daughter walk away, then turned to his wife. "Do you really think what she did was a mistake?" he asked with honest curiosity. Elena crossed her arms, thoughtful. "I don't know, Carlos. I just think we should be teaching her to protect herself, not to give everything away. The world won't always be as kind as it was today." Carlos nodded slowly, though he didn't completely agree. Something inside him was shifting, and though he couldn't quite name what it was, he knew that his daughter's generosity had planted a seed of doubt about his own way of seeing the world. Across the city, in a small, modest apartment, Laura, Sophia's mother, watched her daughter play with the new doll. The little girl's face was lit up with a pure happiness Laura hadn't seen in a long time. "Did that girl really give it to you?" Laura asked, still surprised. Sophia nodded, hugging the doll tightly. "Yes, Mom. She just gave it to me. She said I needed it more than she did." Laura felt a mix of gratitude and a slight twinge of shame. She didn't want her daughter to rely on others' charity, but at the same time, she couldn't help but feel deeply moved by the kindness of that unknown girl. The gesture had brought an unexpected joy to their home, and for a moment, Laura allowed herself to be enveloped by that feeling. However, she also knew that generosity sometimes came at a price, and in her world, accepting help from others often meant facing other complications. But for now, she decided to push those thoughts aside and enjoy her daughter's radiant smile, knowing that, although the world was tough, there were still small glimmers of hope in it. The story of two families, different in almost every way, was beginning to intertwine, and although neither Isabella nor Sophia knew it yet, their lives had already begun to change in irreversible ways. The following morning brought a sense of apparent calm to Isabella's home. Sunlight timidly filtered through the windows, while the soft hum of traffic filled the room. Carlos sat in the kitchen, quietly sipping his coffee, still reflecting on the events of the previous day. His daughter's unexpected generosity had stirred something inside him, but he still couldn't put a name to it. Elena, on the other hand, had resumed her routine with almost mechanical efficiency. She was preparing breakfast while scrolling through her phone, maintaining a neutral expression, though her mind was racing. She was still mulling over what had happened at the toy store. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about Isabella's behavior wasn't quite right. From her perspective, excessive generosity was a sign of weakness that could make her daughter vulnerable in the future. Isabella entered the kitchen, still half asleep, but with the inner peace that only children can have after a genuine act of kindness. She greeted her parents with a smile, unaware of the silent tension in the air. "Good morning, Dad." "Good morning, Mom." Carlos smiled back, while Elena, though she greeted her as well, watched her with a calculating look. "Good morning, Isa," Elena replied, handing her a plate of toast. "We have to leave early today. We've got several things to do." Isabella nodded, but didn't seem too concerned. She was still in her own world, recalling the joy on Sophia's face when she received the doll. After breakfast, as Carlos got ready to leave for work, Elena saw an opportunity to speak with her daughter alone. She sat down next to her on the couch, adopting a soft but deliberate tone. "Isa, sweetheart," Elena began, stroking her daughter's hair. "I've been thinking about what you did yesterday." Isabella looked up, curious, but unaware of where the conversation was headed. "About the doll?" she asked innocently. Elena nodded, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, that. I know you did it with the best intentions, but I want you to think a bit about what it means, not just for you, but for us as a family." Isabella furrowed her brow, not quite understanding. "What does it mean, Mom?" she asked, with a mix of confusion and interest. Elena leaned forward slightly, in a more intimate gesture. "Look, sweetheart, there are many people in life who don't have what we have, and that's okay. We can't always help them, and we shouldn't always do so. You need to think about yourself, about what you need and what you want. If you spend your life giving to others, you'll end up with nothing left for yourself. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Isabella remained silent for a moment. Something about her mother's words didn't sit right. She hadn't felt like she was losing anything by giving the doll away. In fact, she felt more whole, more connected to the world. "But Mom," she finally said, her voice soft but firm, "I didn't lose anything. I still have my things, and I was happy to give that girl the doll. Elena watched her, trying to find a way to make her understand without sounding too harsh. I know, sweetheart, but you have to be careful. The world is a complicated place. If people see that you're too generous, they can take advantage of you. I don't want that to happen. I want you to think a little more about what you need before worrying about others. Isabella nodded slowly, but her heart wasn't fully convinced. She felt that her mother wanted to protect her, but didn't understand why that protection meant not helping others. As Isabella processed her mother's words, Carlos, standing by the door, had been listening to the conversation. While he couldn't hear every word clearly, he understood the tone. Something about the way Elena was speaking to their daughter unsettled him. He didn't like the idea of Isabella starting to see the world through a lens of distrust and fear, something he hadn't wanted to instill in her up to this point. "Everything okay here?" Carlos asked, interrupting the conversation as he adjusted his watch. "It seems like you're discussing something important." Elena smiled quickly, though her eyes revealed a hint of frustration at the interruption. "Yes, everything's fine. I was just explaining to Isa that it's good to be generous, but it's also important to think of yourself," she said in a casual tone, trying to mask the depth of the conversation. Carlos didn't respond immediately. In his mind, he replayed the scene at the toy store, the face of that little girl, and his daughter's decision. Although he understood Elena's perspective, something inside him told him that this wasn't the direction he wanted for Isabella. He decided to let the comment slide for now, but he knew that later he'd have to have a more serious conversation with his wife. "Well, if everything's fine, I'll head to work," said Carlos, turning to Isabella and giving her a kiss on the forehead. "Be good, Isa." Isabella smiled and nodded. "I always am, Dad." Carlos left the house, but his mind lingered on the conversation. He knew there would be more moments like this in the future, where he and Elena wouldn't fully agree on how to raise Isabella. And, although they had managed to maintain a facade of harmony until now, this incident was starting to reveal small cracks in their shared worldview. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Laura watched her daughter Sophia play with the new doll. The little girl's joy filled the small room, but behind Laura's eyes was a constant worry. Although she deeply appreciated the gesture from the unknown girl, she couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. The gift, well-intentioned as it was, reminded her of how much her own family lacked. Laura felt the weight of the idea that her daughter had to depend on the generosity of others to get things that she, as a mother, should be able to provide. Sophia, oblivious to her mother's thoughts, hugged the doll tightly, obsessively brushing its hair as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Look, Mom, now the doll is my best friend," Sophia said with a radiant smile. "She'll always be with me." Laura smiled faintly, but the weight of her concerns kept her from fully enjoying the moment. "I'm glad you're happy, Sophie," Laura replied, forcing a smile. "But remember, we can't always rely on others to give us things, okay? We have to work for what we want." Sophia nodded, but didn't seem to give much importance to her mother's words. She was too focused on the doll. Laura, however, couldn't stop thinking about what it all represented. For her, accepting the gift had been a mixture of gratitude and defeat. The conversation between mother and daughter echoed distantly what was happening in Isabella's home. Two worlds separated by circumstances, but intertwined by a gesture of generosity that seemed to have deep repercussions for both families. Later that day, when Carlos returned home, he found Elena in the living room, going through some bills. He decided it was the right time to talk. "Can I ask you something?" Carlos began, sitting down across from her. Elena looked up, her expression cautious. "Sure, what's going on?" Carlos took a deep breath before continuing. "I didn't like how you talked to Isa this morning. I understand you want to protect her, but I think we're teaching her to be too distrustful. Don't you think it's important that she keeps her heart open?" Elena watched him closely, trying to understand his stance. "Carlos, it's not distrust. It's realism," she replied, with a firmer tone than she expected. "I want our daughter to grow up strong, not to rely on others or feel responsible for solving other people's problems." Carlos slowly shook his head. But what she did wasn't weakness. It was strength. It was kindness. "I don't want her to grow up thinking that being kind is a disadvantage." Elena sighed, knowing they wouldn't easily come to an agreement. "It's not about being kind, Carlos. It's about surviving in a world that's not always going to be kind to her." The words hung in the air, creating an invisible crack between them. Though they both wanted the best for their daughter, their worldviews seemed increasingly opposed. And at the center of it all was Isabella, a child whose simple act of generosity had exposed the hidden tensions in her family. However, what neither of them knew was that the consequences of that act were just beginning, and the impact of Isabella's decisions would resonate far beyond the walls of their home. The tension in Isabella's home didn't disappear as the days went by. On the contrary, it seemed like there was an invisible crack widening between Carlos and Elena. They both maintained a facade of normalcy, but the underlying conflict over how to raise their daughter remained. To Carlos, Isabella's kindness was a reflection of her purity, something to be nurtured. But to Elena, that same kindness could become a dangerous weakness, a vulnerability the world would not hesitate to exploit. Isabella, for her part, sensed the shift in the energy at home, though she didn't fully understand the cause. She knew that giving away the doll had sparked more conversation than she expected, but she didn't understand why something that felt so right seemed to bother her mother so much. It was a Saturday afternoon when the family conflict took a new turn. Elena had been busy that morning with her own responsibilities, organizing an important dinner at their house for some of Carlos's business partners. She had everything under control, but at the same time, something inside her felt unsettled. Deep down, she felt like her authority as a mother was being challenged, that her daughter, whom she loved deeply, was heading down a path that wasn't right for her. And that, more than anything, filled her with constant worry. Isabella was sitting in her room, drawing in her notebook. She was focusing on a scene she had seen days earlier. The girl with the doll, smiling under the sunlight. She was lost in thought when she heard her mother calling from the living room. "Isa." Elena's voice was firm. "Come here for a minute, please." Isabella put her notebook aside and walked downstairs. Elena was waiting by the window, looking out at the street with a serious expression. "What's going on, Mom?" Isabella asked as she approached. Elena sighed before turning to face her daughter. There was a calmness in her eyes, but underneath the surface, something else was brewing. "I need you to listen to me carefully, Isa," Elena began, choosing her words carefully. "You know I've always wanted the best for you, right?" Isabella nodded slowly, a bit confused by her mother's serious tone. "Of course, Mom. So you also know that as your mother, it's my job to teach you how to handle things the right way," Elena continued, stepping closer to her daughter. "What you did with the doll, while it was a nice gesture, could have consequences you can't even imagine. People, Isa, aren't always what they seem. Sometimes being too generous or trusting can get you into trouble. People might misinterpret your actions or, worse, take advantage of you." Isabella lowered her gaze, feeling trapped once again in a conversation she didn't fully understand. Why was her mother insisting so much on this? What had she done wrong? "Mom, I just wanted to help," she said quietly. "I didn't think it was a bad thing." Elena sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and affection. "It's not that it's bad, Isa," she said softly, "but you have to think about yourself first. Sometimes giving to others without thinking about what you need can make you miss out on opportunities or, worse, let others take advantage of your kindness. I want you to be strong and learn how to protect yourself." Isabella didn't respond immediately. She was trying to process what her mother was saying, but something inside her still resisted the idea. Why did helping others have to be dangerous? Before she could answer, Carlos entered the room. He had heard enough from the kitchen to know that this conversation wasn't going anywhere productive. "Elena," he intervened with a calm but firm tone, "I don't think this is the right way to handle this." Elena looked at him, clearly surprised by his interruption. "Carlos, I'm trying to teach our daughter something important," she responded, trying to keep her composure. "We can't let her think the world is all flowers and rainbows. She needs to know there are people who might take advantage of her kindness." Carlos nodded, but his expression didn't change. "I understand that, but we also need to let her discover the world on her own. We can't instill fear every time she wants to do something good for someone else." His gaze shifted to Isabella, who was still watching them, feeling as if she were at the center of a battle she didn't fully understand. What she did wasn't weakness. It was strength. Elena pressed her lips together, feeling the tension growing between them. "It's not about fear, Carlos. It's about teaching her to protect herself." "Protect herself from what?" Carlos asked, crossing his arms. "From a little girl who just wanted a doll? We're not talking about a threat here, Elena. We're talking about kindness. If we teach Isa that being generous is dangerous, what kind of person will she become when she grows up?" Elena didn't respond immediately. She was torn between her instinct to protect her daughter and the conviction that Carlos didn't fully understand what she was trying to say. But the conversation didn't go further. The doorbell rang, and the dinner she had organized was about to begin. "We'll talk about this later," Elena said, momentarily ending the discussion. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Laura, Sophia's mother, was at work, juggling several responsibilities at her job. She worked as a cleaner in an office building, and although she was always diligent and responsible, the financial situation wasn't improving. The doll her daughter had received was still a constant reminder of how much she couldn't provide for Sophia. As she cleaned one of the offices, she overheard two men talking near the door. She recognized one of the names, Carlos, Isabella's father. He and another partner were discussing some projects. Although she couldn't hear much, she caught enough to know that Carlos was involved in something related to his responsibilities at the company where she worked. At that moment, a dangerous idea began to form in Laura's mind. Maybe, just maybe, she could take advantage of that connection. She wasn't someone who liked depending on others, but desperation has a way of clouding people's morals. What if she used the fact that her daughter had benefited from Isabella's generosity as a way to get closer to Carlos? Perhaps he, feeling some kind of moral responsibility, could help her find a better job or at least offer some financial support. Laura tried to shake the idea away, but a small seed had already been planted. Her pride was in conflict with the need to provide a better life for Sophia. The line between dignity and survival was starting to blur in her mind. A few days later, fate brought the two families together again. It was a Sunday afternoon when Isabella and Carlos went for a walk in the park. The weather was pleasant, with a gentle breeze causing the leaves on the trees to sway slowly. Isabella was running a few meters ahead of her father, laughing and enjoying the freedom of the afternoon. That's when Carlos saw her. Laura, sitting on a nearby bench, was watching her daughter Sophia play in the park. Although there were many children around, Carlos recognized the girl immediately. She was the same one who had received the doll from Isabella, and next to her was the mother. Isabella saw her too. She stopped in her tracks, her eyes lit up with recognition, and a smile spread across her face. She ran toward Sophia without a second thought. "Hi," Isabella said excitedly. "It's so good to see you." Sophia, shy at first, smiled widely when she saw Isabella. "Hi," she replied, hugging her doll, the same one Isabella had given her. "Look, I still have my doll." Carlos watched from a distance as the two girls started playing together, as if they had known each other their entire lives. He decided to approach Laura, who was also watching the interaction with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Hi," Carlos greeted, making an effort to sound casual. "I think our daughters already know each other." Laura smiled, although something in her eyes revealed the discomfort she felt. "Yes, it seems so. Isabella was very generous with Sophia. I don't know how to thank her." Carlos shrugged, downplaying it. "There's no need to thank her. Isabella did it because she has a big heart." The awkward silence that hovered between Carlos and Laura in the park was palpable, but the laughter of the girls played in the background like a distant melody. Carlos tried to keep the conversation light, though he felt there was something unsaid, something Laura was holding back. He knew the economic situation for many families like Laura's was tough, but he didn't want to invade her privacy by asking more than she was willing to share. However, deep down, Carlos sensed that Laura was dealing with more than just gratitude. Laura, for her part, felt torn. She had spent the last few days reflecting on whether to approach Carlos for help, but her pride was still a barrier. She didn't want her daughter to think they depended on the charity of others, and she certainly didn't want Carlos to see her as a woman seeking favors. Yet, with each passing day, she saw how her situation worsened, and the pressure of being the sole provider for Sophia weighed on her more and more. Laura broke the silence with a sigh, knowing she needed to speak though not sure how to start. "Carlos, I wanted to thank you for what Isabella did for Sophia," she said, trying to sound relaxed, though her fingers nervously fiddled with a loose thread on her purse. "For us, it was a huge gesture. You have no idea how much it meant to my daughter." Carlos nodded, watching the girls who continued to play together. Isabella had brought an unexpected piece to his life with that simple act, but it had also generated a series of tensions and dilemmas with Elena that he could not ignore. "Isabella did it because she has a very big heart," Carlos replied with a gentle smile. "I think she doesn't fully understand the impact she had, but sometimes I believe that children see things with a clarity that we adults lose." Laura nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The knot in her stomach wouldn't go away, and she knew she had to say something more, something that had been on her mind since she saw Carlos in the park. "Carlos," she began, hesitating. "I don't want this to sound wrong, but things have not been easy lately, and I know we don't know each other well, but I wanted to ask if a job opportunity ever comes up at the company where you work, maybe you could let me know. I know I shouldn't ask, and believe me, I don't want to seem ungrateful, but sometimes I don't know what else to do." Carlos looked at her in silence for a few seconds that seemed eternal. He hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn, though deep down he had anticipated it. His first reaction was surprise, but then he felt a mix of empathy and responsibility. He knew Laura was not asking for help out of pity, but out of necessity, and that made him feel a strange mix of compassion and discomfort. "Laura, I perfectly understand what you're saying," he finally responded in a warm tone. "And you shouldn't feel bad about asking for help. We've all been in tough situations, and if an opportunity arises, I'll be happy to let you know. I know how important it is to do everything possible for our children." The relief Laura felt at that moment was tangible, but it also came with a twinge of shame. She didn't want to rely on anyone's goodwill, but her daughter was her priority, and she would do whatever was necessary to give her a better life. "Thank you, Carlos," she murmured, looking down. "Sometimes it's hard to ask for help, but there are times when there's no other choice." Carlos nodded, feeling a new weight on his shoulders. He knew the road ahead would not be easy, not just because of the complications this might bring at work, but also because of the inevitable conversation he would have to have with Elena. That night, when Carlos arrived home, the atmosphere felt dense. Elena was in the kitchen, busy with dinner, but her way of moving revealed that something was bothering her. Throughout the day, she had dwelled on the conversation she had with Isabella, and the more she thought about it, the more she felt that Carlos was not supporting her in raising their daughter. She felt her authority as a mother was being undermined. When Carlos entered the kitchen, Elena barely looked at him. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone casual but loaded with subtext. Carlos immediately sensed that something was off. It was the kind of question that didn't seek an answer but opened the door for a discussion. "Good," he answered cautiously. "I went to the park with Isabella. We met Sophia and her mother." Elena dropped the knife she was using to chop vegetables and turned slowly toward him. "Sophia?" she asked, her eyes shining with a curiosity not entirely innocent. "The same girl from the doll?" Carlos nodded, aware that what he was about to say would not be well received. "Yes, the same. The girls played together, and I talked with her mother for a while." Elena crossed her arms, staring at him intently. "What did you talk about?" she asked, her tone suggesting she was already anticipating an answer she wouldn't like. Carlos hesitated for a second, but decided to be honest. He knew he couldn't hide anything that had happened. "She asked for help, Elena. She's in a tough situation and wants to know if I could let her know if a job opportunity arises at the company. I didn't promise anything, but..." Before he could finish, Elena interrupted him. "Help," she repeated, with a mix of incredulity and disdain. "Are we now responsible for other families' problems? Carlos, what Isabella did is one thing, but this is another. We can't carry the burdens of others." Carlos felt a wave of frustration. He knew this would be her reaction, but that didn't make it any easier to handle. "Elena, it's not about carrying anyone's problems," he said, trying to keep his calm. "It's just an opportunity. Laura is doing everything she can to support her daughter, and if I can help in some way, I don't see why not." Elena shook her head, clearly disagreeing. "And what about us, Carlos? What about our family? We can't be solving other people's problems all the time. It's not our responsibility. We have our own priorities." Carlos felt the conversation was reaching a critical point and decided to be more direct. "Elena, it's not about priorities. It's about being human. Helping others doesn't take away from us. In fact, it makes us better people. I don't want Isabella to grow up seeing that we close ourselves off to others' troubles just because they're not our own." Elena looked at him, clearly affected by his words, but unwilling to yield. "Carlos, I want our daughter to be strong, not naive. The world is not an easy place, and if we keep teaching her that she can solve other people's problems, she's going to suffer when she finds out that's not always possible." Carlos sighed, exhausted by the argument, but unwilling to give up. "Don't you think there's a way to balance both? To teach her to be strong, but also to be generous? Because if we only show her the harsh side of the world, what kind of person will she be?" Elena was silent. There was something in Carlos's words that resonated with her, but her pride was still preventing her from fully conceding. "I don't know, Carlos. I just know I don't want our daughter to suffer." Carlos nodded, understanding that while they both wanted the best for Isabella, they continued to see the world from different perspectives. "I don't want her to suffer either," he replied gently, "but I also want her to be happy. And sometimes, happiness comes from helping others." That night, although the conversation ended, the tension between them did not disappear. They both knew this issue would come up again, and while they wanted the same things for their daughter, the path to that goal remained full of obstacles. Meanwhile, in her small apartment, Laura watched her daughter sleep, clutching her doll. She knew she had taken the first step in something she never imagined doing, relying on others. But for Sophia's sake, she was willing to move forward with whatever was necessary. In her mind, a plan was beginning to take shape. The days following the encounter in the park passed with tense calm. In Isabella's house, the discussions between Carlos and Elena seemed to have cooled down, but beneath the surface, the tension remained latent. The conversation about helping Laura and her daughter Sophia had not really closed. It was simply waiting for its moment to resurface. Isabella, oblivious to the complex conflict simmering between her parents, continued to be immersed in her life as a child, though something in her environment had changed. Sometimes she felt a heaviness in the family atmosphere, as if the unspoken words filled every corner of the house. The home, which used to be a peaceful refuge, now had a different, more charged energy. Laura, for her part, had not stopped thinking about the brief exchange she had with Carlos in the park. Although the promise of help had been received with gratitude, she knew she couldn't rely solely on words. The need to improve her economic situation was becoming more pressing by the day, and while she appreciated Carlos's gesture, she also knew she had to make her own moves. She couldn't just wait for the opportunity to fall from the sky. A week after the encounter in the park, Laura decided to take action. Through an acquaintance, she had managed to obtain the address of the building where Carlos worked. She wasn't entirely sure what she planned to do, but felt she had to try something. It was Friday afternoon when she headed to the location, her stomach twisting with nerves. She knew that approaching Carlos directly at his workplace was risky, but she also felt this might be her only chance. Upon arriving at the building, the large marble lobby and bright lights made her feel small and out of place. Men and women in suits hurried by, all focused on their own affairs, while she stood at the entrance, undecided. What was she doing there? Had she gone too far? Before she could turn back, Carlos appeared in the lobby, talking on the phone. Laura spotted him immediately and felt her heart race. For a moment, she thought about leaving, but something stopped her. Carlos also saw her, and although his face showed initial surprise, he approached her with a friendly, albeit slightly confused, smile. "Laura," said Carlos, putting his phone in his pocket. "I wasn't expecting to see you here. Everything all right?" Laura, feeling the awkwardness of the moment, tried to smile, but it was clear she was nervous. "Yes, everything's fine. Well, sort of," she replied with a nervous laugh. "I was in the area and thought maybe we could talk for a moment." Carlos looked at her intently. He could tell something was going on, that Laura wasn't there by chance. "Sure," he said, gesturing for her to follow him to a quieter corner of the lobby. "What's on your mind?" Laura took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "Look, I know I asked you for help last time, and I really appreciate that you considered it. But I also know I shouldn't be here. I don't want you to think that I'm trying to take advantage of your generosity or your daughter's. It's just that things are getting more complicated, and I don't know what else to do." Carlos listened quietly, absorbing every word. Laura's voice trembled, and it was evident she had spent many nights worrying about what she was about to say. He was moved by her vulnerability, but at the same time knew the situation was delicate, both because of his relationship with Elena and the possible implications at work. "Laura, I understand what you're going through," he said sincerely. "And don't worry, I don't think you're taking advantage of anything. I know how hard it can be to raise a child alone and in a tough situation." Laura looked down, grateful but also uncomfortable. She didn't want to appear weak, but reality had forced her to be more honest than she had ever been. "It's just that I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Sophia is everything to me, and I'm willing to do anything so that she lacks nothing. I don't want her to grow up feeling she can't have what other kids have." Carlos nodded, understanding the depth of her words. It was clear that Laura was concerned not just about economic security, but about what it meant emotionally for her daughter. He was about to respond when suddenly, his phone rang. Seeing his boss's name on the screen, he knew he had to take the call. "Give me a second, Laura," he said, raising a hand in apology as he answered the phone. While Carlos spoke quietly on the other side of the line, Laura took the moment to reflect on what she was doing. Was this really the right way to solve her problems? Her mind was divided. On one hand, she knew she needed to do something for Sophia's sake. On the other, She couldn't ignore the weight of her pride. Carlos finished the call a few minutes later, and his expression was somewhat more serious. He knew he had to return to work, but also that he couldn't just leave Laura in that state. "Laura," he said gently, "I'd like to help you, but I need a little more time to see if something comes up at the company. I don't want to promise anything I can't deliver, but I'll do my best. Give me a few days, okay?" Laura nodded, a mix of relief and resignation in her expression. She knew Carlos was doing the best he could, but the clock was still ticking for her and Sophia. "Thank you, Carlos," she murmured. "I really appreciate it." Carlos smiled, but something in his eyes reflected the burden of responsibility he felt in trying to help. "See you soon," he said before saying goodbye and returning to his work. Meanwhile, at home, Elena had started moving in a completely different direction. The feeling that Carlos was not on her side had fueled a restlessness in her, and she decided she needed to take control of the situation. She couldn't bear the idea that her family was getting involved in the problems of others. For her, the first duty was to protect Isabella and maintain the stability of their home. Elena started making some calls. Using her own network of contacts, she began investigating Laura's situation. She knew something didn't quite add up. Although what Laura had shared sounded genuine, Elena's suspicious nature led her to doubt. She wanted to make sure there wasn't something else behind Laura's request, something that could jeopardize the safety of her family. A few days later, she got the information she needed. Through an acquaintance in human resources, she discovered that Laura had been facing financial problems for years, even before Sophia was born. Although nothing she found was particularly scandalous, Elena interpreted it as confirmation that Laura wasn't someone to be trusted. For Elena, this reinforced the idea that Laura was trying to take advantage of Carlos and his family's situation. That same night, when Carlos came home, he found Elena waiting for him in the living room, with a cold and determined expression on her face. "We need to talk," Elena said before he could even greet her. Carlos set his briefcase down by the door, immediately recognizing the severe tone in her voice. He knew this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to stay calm, though he could feel that something serious was about to happen. Elena looked him straight in the eye, crossing her arms. "I've been investigating Laura," she said with a coldness that surprised him. "And I've discovered some things about her situation. Things you should know before you continue with this idea of helping her." Carlos frowned, feeling a wave of frustration as he heard what his wife had done. "You investigated her?" he repeated, unable to hide his disbelief. "Why would you do that?" Elena didn't back down. "Because I have to protect our family, Carlos. We can't get involved in someone's life without knowing exactly what we're getting into. I'm not willing to risk the stability of our life for someone we don't know well." Carlos ran a hand through his hair, trying to keep the growing tension in his chest under control. "Elena, it's not our job to investigate other people's lives. If Laura needs help, I don't see the problem in offering it, as long as we can." Elena shook her head, refusing to budge. "It's not that simple, Carlos. We can't save everyone. And I'm not going to let this situation spiral out of control." Carlos sighed, knowing they were at a deadlock. "This isn't just about Laura, Elena. It's about who we are as people, as a family. I don't want our daughter growing up thinking we have to shut ourselves off from other people's problems. Is that what we want to teach her?" Elena didn't respond immediately, but her silence spoke volumes. They both knew this battle wouldn't end here. As they looked at each other, each convinced of their own truth, the web of lies, manipulations, and tensions continued to grow, threatening to explode at any moment. Meanwhile, Laura walked through the city streets, thinking about her next move. She knew Carlos' promise wasn't a guarantee, and she couldn't rely on him completely. The weight of her decisions, and what she was willing to do for her daughter, kept pressing on her. The lies and entanglements between the two families were beginning to take shape, and although they didn't know it yet, the resolution was quickly approaching, with consequences none of them could foresee. The days passed with a tense calm in Carlos and Elena's house. Although the arguments about Laura and the help Carlos wanted to offer her seemed to have stopped, the tension in the air was palpable. Both moved around their daily tasks as if walking on glass, avoiding the conflict they knew was about to erupt. Isabella, always perceptive to her parents' emotions, also sensed the change. Although she continued with her routine, going to school and playing with her friends, the feeling that something wasn't right between her mom and dad was constant. She often found herself wondering if she had been the cause of the conflict, if the simple act of giving the doll to Sophia had triggered a series of problems in her family that she couldn't quite understand. Meanwhile, Laura had decided not to wait any longer. She knew Carlos was a good person, but she also understood that she couldn't rely on vague promises. She decided to take more direct action. If she wanted to secure a better future for her daughter, she needed to find a more stable job or get significant help, even if it meant putting her pride on the line. One Thursday morning, Laura made a decision. Dressed simply but with determination on her face, she went directly to the building where Carlos worked. This time, there were no doubts in her mind. It wasn't just about a casual conversation in the park or a chance encounter. She was determined to speak face-to-face with him and ask for a clear answer. When she arrived in the lobby, the receptionist looked at her with some curiosity but didn't ask any questions. Over the years, he had learned that many people came looking for favors or making special requests, and Laura didn't seem any different from the others. However, what he didn't know was that Laura was in a much more delicate situation. "I'm here to see Carlos Munoz," she said, with a firm voice that betrayed her nerves. The receptionist checked his computer before making a quick call. "One moment, please." As Laura waited, each second felt endless. Finally, after what seemed like hours, one of Carlos's assistants appeared in the lobby and greeted her. "Ms. Laura, Carlos can see you in a few minutes." "Can you come with me?" said the assistant politely. Laura followed the assistant to a small meeting room. Her hands were cold, and the knot in her stomach tightened with each step. Finally, the door opened, and Carlos entered with a friendly but somewhat tense expression. "Laura, I wasn't expecting to see you today," Carlos said, taking a seat across from her. Laura smiled weakly, aware of how uncomfortable the situation was. "I know this is a bit unexpected," she began, "but I needed to talk to you directly. I know you said you would let me know if something came up, but the truth is, things are getting worse for me and Sophia, and I can't wait any longer." Carlos leaned forward, listening carefully. Although he had anticipated that Laura might reach out to him again, he hadn't expected the situation to be so urgent. "I understand, Laura," he responded sincerely. "And believe me, I've been trying to see if I could find something in the company that fits your needs. But it's not that simple. The problem isn't just finding a position. There's more at stake, like making sure it fits within the current structure and—" Laura interrupted him, feeling that Carlos's words were turning into excuses. "Carlos, I know you're trying to help, but I don't need you to give me a position in the company. I just need something, anything, to get by for now. A temporary job, a contact, something that will allow me to support Sophia without resorting to charity." Carlos looked at her, surprised by the bluntness of her words. It was clear that Laura wasn't asking for favors, but for an opportunity, one she was willing to earn. He realized that he had underestimated her determination. "Let me talk to some of my contacts," he finally said, relenting. "I can't promise anything right now, but I'll do my best to find something. Does that work?" Laura nodded, more relieved than grateful. She knew her situation was still precarious, but at least Carlos had agreed to actively seek a solution. "Thank you, Carlos," she said, standing up. "I just hope this doesn't become a burden for you." Carlos shook his head, smiling slightly. "It's not, Laura. I just want to do the right thing." But as Laura left the room, Carlos knew that this favor wouldn't be well received at home, and the persistent tension with Elena was about to explode. That afternoon, as Carlos returned home, he couldn't stop thinking about his conversation with Laura. He knew that if Elena found out he had agreed to help in a more direct way, things could become even more tense between them. However, he had no intention of hiding it, because he believed that helping someone in need was the right thing to do. Elena would have to understand, or at least, that's what he hoped. But when he got home, Elena was already waiting for him in the living room, and from the expression on her face, Carlos knew something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked, trying to stay calm. Elena, with a frown and a face full of restrained anger, held up a printed copy of an email she had accidentally found. "This is what's going on," she said, tossing the paper onto the table between them. Carlos picked it up, his heart racing as he read the lines that confirmed what he feared. Elena had discovered that he had spoken with some of his contacts about helping Laura. "Elena, I can explain," he began to say. "Explain," she interrupted, her voice icy. "What is there to explain, Carlos? You told me you weren't going to get involved with that woman anymore, and now I find out you're pulling strings to help her. What else haven't you told me?" Carlos felt the pressure of the situation. He knew Elena was pushing him to his limits, but he also understood that he couldn't back down. His morals, and what he believed to be right, were at stake. "Elena, I'm helping someone in need," he said finally, with firmness. "Laura is in a desperate situation. She's not a threat to us. She just needs an opportunity, and I believe helping her is the right thing to do." Elena looked at him with a mix of disbelief and disappointment. "And what about our family, Carlos? Where does our family fit into all this? It's not our responsibility to save others, and I don't want Isabella growing up in a family that gets involved in everyone else's problems." "Our family isn't in danger, Elena," Carlos replied, his voice rising slightly. "We're talking about a mother struggling to support her daughter. How can you think that's a threat?" Elena remained silent for a moment, her face hardened. Then, without saying another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Carlos alone with his thoughts and the growing sense that this time, the conflict might be irreparable. The conflict between Carlos and Elena continued to erode the peace at home. Although both tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy for Isabella, the tension between them was undeniable. Every small disagreement, every gesture, every look was filled with a silent resentment that only grew stronger over time. Isabella, for her part, was increasingly noticing the emotional distance between her parents. The moments when they used to laugh and talk at the dinner table had turned into awkward silences, which she tried, unsuccessfully, to fill with stories from school or innocent questions. Although she was only a child, she could sense that something was very wrong. One afternoon, while playing with Sophia at the park, Isabella decided to talk to her about what was happening at home. "I feel like my parents are fighting all the time," she told Sophia, as they pushed their dolls in small strollers. Sophia, who had grown up in a difficult environment where her mother struggled to maintain balance, looked at her with empathy. "My mom worries a lot sometimes too," Sophia replied. "But she tells me the most important thing is that we're always together, no matter what." Isabella nodded, although she wasn't sure how that applied to her situation. Her parents didn't seem together at the moment. They seemed more distant than ever. Meanwhile, Laura had received the call she had been waiting for. One of Carlos's contacts had recommended her for a position at a small company, and although it wasn't exactly what she was hoping for, it was a job. Something concrete that would allow her to stay afloat, at least for a while. That night, when Laura received the news, she felt a wave of relief. She knew this job wouldn't solve all her problems, but it was a start. She could give Sophia a more stable life, and that was all that mattered. She called Carlos immediately to thank him. "Carlos, I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I got the job. It's not much, but it's a relief to know I can start working right away." Carlos smiled on the other end of the line, feeling a mix of satisfaction and relief. "I'm glad to hear that, Laura. I knew you'd find something. I just hope this helps you move forward." "It will, Carlos. It will," she replied before hanging up. But while Carlos felt satisfied with having helped, he knew that his success would bring more problems at home. Elena would soon find out what had happened, and when she did, the argument they had left unresolved would erupt with renewed force. That night, when Carlos came home, he found Elena waiting for him in the living room once again. This time, her expression wasn't just angry. It was something deeper. There was a cold determination in her eyes. "I know what you did, Carlos," she said, without preamble. "You helped Laura. You got her a job." Carlos nodded slowly, knowing there was no point in denying it. "I did, and I would do it again. Laura needed help, and I couldn't just stand by." Elena looked at him, incredulous. "Do you realize what this means for us?" Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with bitterness. "You've crossed a line, Carlos. You didn't just ignore me. You put another family ahead of ours." Carlos frowned, feeling the injustice of her words. "I didn't put anyone ahead of us, Elena. I just did what I thought was right." "When did helping someone become a betrayal?" Elena looked at him with eyes lost in the depths of her own pride. "You wouldn't understand," she said, her voice cracking slightly, "because you don't understand what it means to protect what you love most." Carlos looked at her, deeply hurt by those words. "You're wrong, Elena. I not only understand it, I'm doing it. It just seems like we have very different definitions of what it means to love someone." Elena remained silent, and at that moment, both of them knew their relationship was on the verge of collapse. The lies, the manipulations, and the resentments had woven a web of entanglements that threatened to destroy everything that had once been their home. That night, as silence filled their bedroom, Elena knew she had to make a decision. The pride that had guided so many of her actions was now at war with her sense of family, and as she looked at Carlos sleeping beside her, she realized she would continue to lose him if she didn't give up some of the control she so deeply valued. However, she wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. The wounds were still open, and the resentment continued to burn in her heart. Meanwhile, the lives of Carlos, Laura, Isabella, and Sophia remained intertwined, and the outcome was drawing nearer, with a fate none of them could foresee. The atmosphere in Carlos and Elena's home had become unbearable. Every conversation between them seemed laden with silent reproaches, unspoken words, and looks that could no longer hide the accumulated resentment. Elena had thrown herself into her daily routine with a rigidity that masked the emotional tension she felt. Carlos, on the other hand, spent more time away from home, finding any excuse to work late or take Isabella to activities outside the house. Isabella, although only 8 years old, was not oblivious to what was happening. She knew something wasn't right between her parents, although she didn't fully understand what it was. The warmth of her home had disappeared, replaced by a coldness in the air that unsettled her. She often retreated to her room, surrounded by her toys, thinking of simpler times. The doll she had given to Sophia had been the trigger for something she never could have imagined. One afternoon, after school, while Isabella was drawing in her room, she overheard a louder than usual argument between her parents. The voices, though muffled by the walls, were unmistakable. She got up from her bed, her heart pounding, and walked to the end of the hallway. There, from a distance, she heard fragments of the conversation. "It's not just about Laura, Carlos," Elena was saying with a mix of frustration and pain. "It's everything. It's how you ignore what I feel, how you make decisions without even consulting me. It's not just you and me. There's a child in the middle of all this, and it seems like you've forgotten that." Carlos, whose voice sounded more tired than angry, replied, "Elena, I haven't forgotten about Isabella or you, but I can't just stand by when someone needs help. I thought you knew me better than that." "I do know you, Carlos," Elena retorted, "and that's what scares me. You get lost in your good intentions and forget about the consequences. You're so busy trying to save others that you forget about your own family." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella, feeling like she shouldn't be listening, slowly retreated to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She knew her parents weren't okay, and that something was about to change. But what she didn't know was that this conflict was about to reach a point of no return. As the days passed, Carlos began to notice that Elena was pulling away more and more, not just emotionally, but also physically. She started spending more time with her friends, organizing outings, and finding any excuse to be out of the house. The resentment had taken deep root in her heart, and although deep down she knew she still loved Carlos, her wounded pride and the feeling of having been ignored were stronger. One afternoon, while Carlos was at work, Elena made a decision she had been postponing. She decided that she needed a break, some time away to clear her head. With a knot in her stomach, she packed a small suitcase, knowing that this act was not just a break, but a statement about the state of her marriage. When Isabella came home from school, Elena had already made arrangements for her to stay with Carlos. "Isa, sweetheart," Elena said, trying to sound calm, "I'm going to be away for a few days. I'm staying with Aunt Sandra. Daddy will take care of you in the meantime, okay?" Isabella, confused and a little scared, looked at her mother. "Why, Mom? Are you leaving because of Dad?" she asked, her eyes filled with worry. Elena sighed, kneeling down to her daughter's level. "No, Isa, it's not that. I just need some time to think. But I promise everything will be okay. Do you trust me?" Isabella nodded slowly, though in her heart she wasn't sure that everything would be okay. That night, when Carlos came home and found Elena's note explaining her decision, he knew the conflict had reached its peak. He sat at the kitchen table, the note trembling in his hands, while Isabella watched from the doorway, feeling a mix of fear and sadness. "Dad, what's happening?" Isabella asked, her voice fragile. Carlos looked at her, and at that moment, he knew he had to be honest with his daughter. "Mom and we're not agreeing on a lot of things right now, Isa," he began. "And while I don't know what's going to happen, I want you to know that we love you more than anything in the world. No matter what, that's never going to change." Isabella, though she barely understood the magnitude of what was happening, approached her father and hugged him tightly. In that moment, Carlos felt the full weight of the decisions he had made. He wondered if, in trying to help Laura, he had neglected his own family. But something inside him told him that he couldn't have acted any other way. Doing the right thing always comes with a cost, and he was willing to bear it. The days following Elena's departure were difficult. Carlos found himself in a state of uncertainty, unsure if his marriage would survive this separation. He spent more time with Isabella, trying to keep their routine as normal as possible, though he knew his daughter was smart enough to notice her mother's absence. Elena, meanwhile, took refuge at her sister's house, searching for clarity. She knew she needed space, but she also knew she couldn't avoid the situation forever. After several days of reflection and long conversations with Sandra, she began to wonder if she had overreacted. The pride she had so fiercely protected now seemed like a barrier between her and the family she loved so much. One afternoon, while sitting on her sister's balcony, gazing out at the city, Elena received a message from Carlos. "We need to talk?" She knew this moment was inevitable, but she hadn't expected the mix of fear and hope she felt. The next day, she returned home. When she walked in, she found Carlos sitting in the living room, waiting for her. The house was quiet. Isabella was at school, giving them the chance to talk without interruptions. Elena sat across from him, and for a moment, they both sat in silence. They knew there were many things that needed to be said, but finding the right words wasn't easy. "I don't want to lose you," Carlos said first, breaking the silence. His eyes reflected the exhaustion from weeks of tension, but also the determination to fight for his marriage. Elena looked at him, feeling her wall of pride beginning to crumble. "Carlos, it was never about Laura," she finally said. "It was about feeling like we weren't on the same team, that you were making decisions without thinking about me, about us." Carlos nodded, knowing there was truth in her words. "I know, and I regret not involving you more," he replied. "But I always wanted to do the right thing. For you, for Isabella, and for the people around us. I didn't think trying to help someone could hurt us." Elena sighed, feeling her emotions begin to surface. "It wasn't the help itself, Carlos. It was the fact that I felt like you weren't listening to me, that my concerns didn't matter. But now I realize my pride blinded me. I was so worried about protecting our family that I forgot you were doing the same thing, in your own way." Carlos leaned forward, taking Elena's hand between his. "Can we try again?" he asked softly. "I know it won't be easy, but I think we can find a balance. A place where we can be a team without losing ourselves." Elena looked into his eyes, and at that moment, she knew she wanted to try. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but she also knew that the love they shared hadn't faded. It had been tested, but it was still there, beating beneath the surface of resentments and wounds. "Yes, we can try," she replied with a small smile. "But this time, we have to do it together." Elena's return home was a new beginning. Though the wounds wouldn't heal immediately, both knew they were committed to working on their relationship. They learned that it wasn't just about protecting their family, but about learning to listen to and respect each other. Laura, for her part, found stability in her new job and was able to start giving Sophia the life she had always dreamed of. Although she would never forget the support Carlos had given her, she also understood that true strength lay in not relying on others forever. She had found her own path, and that was the most valuable thing. Isabella, seeing her parents come together again, felt the warmth return to her home. The tension slowly dissipated, and although she knew things would never be exactly as they were before, she understood that love and understanding could overcome any conflict. In the end, what started as a simple act of kindness, a gift of a doll, set off a series of events that tested the character, love, and values of everyone involved. But ultimately, each of them came out stronger, wiser, and with a new perspective on what it truly means to help others and protect those you love. And so, the lives of Carlos, Elena, Isabella, Laura, and Sophia, though intertwined by chance and necessity, found their own balance. An imperfect balance, but enough to move forward together. What did you think of this story? Tell us in the comments. What would you do in a similar situation? We invite you to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with your friends or family as a show of support. This motivates us to continue uploading exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that's about to appear on your screen. We greatly value having you here with us. You can click on the links now appearing on your screen. We've selected captivating stories and guaranteed entertainment just for you. See you in the next video. A big hug.